The station clock had been dead for 4 years, but every Monday at exactly 5:17, Mara Ellison still found herself standing beneath it. Not because the westbound stage still came through Cinder Wells. It did not. Not because anyone had asked her to be there. Because 4 years earlier, a man had promised he would return on that platform before the hands reached 6. So when Cal Rourke rode back into town with desert dust on his coat and asked, almost smiling, "You still waiting?" every voice near the depot went quiet. Mara looked at the man who had cost her 4 winters. Then she said, "I was. Then I learned the difference between waiting and being left." The smile disappeared from his face, and above them the dead clock held its hands at 5:17. Cinder Wells was the kind of town that remembered what people wanted forgotten. It remembered who had gone broke during the dry year, who had slept in the jail after Founder's Day, who had promised marriage beneath the cottonwoods and boarded a stage before sunrise. By noon the town knew Cal Rourke had returned. By 1 it knew Mara had spoken to him. By 2 people had already changed her words 3 different ways. Mara ignored all of it. She stepped down from the depot platform with a flour sack under one arm and a ledger tucked beneath the other. The wind pulled at the hem of her brown work dress. One cuff had been mended twice. The leather of her boots had gone pale at the toes from lye water and dust. Cal stood beside a bay gelding, one hand resting on the saddle horn. He was broader than she remembered, leaner through the face. There was a white line near his left eyebrow and road wear in the way he held his shoulders, as if part of him still expected the ground to move beneath him. He had been 26 when he left. She had been 23. They had thought 4 months was a long time. Neither of them had known what 4 years could do. "You heard me," Mara said. Cal glanced toward the silent clock. "I heard you. Good." She started toward Ellison House, the boarding house her mother had opened when Cinder Wells was still 2 streets and a well. Cal fell into step beside her. Mara stopped. "So that's how this is going to be." He stopped too. "How what's going to be?" "You ride in after 4 years, ask a question in front of half the town, then follow me like we only missed supper." A wagon passed at the far end of the road, iron rims grinding over hard dirt. Cal looked down once, then back at her. "No," he said, "I don't suppose it gets to be that easy. It doesn't get to be anything." The words were sharper than she intended. He took them without flinching. Mara hated him a little for that. She hated that she remembered his temper. And this was not it. Hated that the boy who had left with 3 shirts and a borrowed saddle had come back knowing how to hold still. She shifted the flour sack higher. Cal reached for it. She moved it away. "I can carry it. I know." Then stop reaching. His hand dropped. Mara turned and continued down the street. This time he did not follow. Ellison House sat 1 block from the depot, a 2-story frame building with 8 narrow rooms, a kitchen that never cooled, and a porch that leaned half an inch toward the street. Traveling salesmen called it modest. Rail workers called it clean. Mara called it the reason she had not left Cinder Wells. Her mother had died 2 winters earlier, after a fever that came hard and stayed 3 days. The doctor's fee, the medicine, and the months without boarders had turned a manageable note into a dangerous one. $640. 12% interest, payment due before the first snow. The numbers lived in Mara's head like a second clock. Inside the kitchen, Ruthie Bell was cutting onions with the concentration of a surgeon. Ruthie was 60 if anyone asked, and 70 if they did not. She had run the Cinder Wells telegraph desk for 21 years until Gideon Vale bought the depot lease and replaced her with his nephew. She looked up as Mara entered. "Well?" Mara set the flour on the table. "Well, what? Don't make me old and patient at the same time." Mara opened the ledger. "Mr. Hewitt still owes for 2 nights. The mill charged us 3 cents more a sack, and the roof over room 6 is leaking again." Ruthie lowered the knife. "He looks different?" Mara's fingers stopped on the page. "Who?" "The roof." Mara gave her a look. Ruthie resumed cutting. "Thought so." Mara turned to the stove, where beans simmered in an iron pot. She lifted the lid, although she already knew they were not burning. "He asked if I was still waiting." Ruthie's knife paused again. "And what did you say?" "The truth." "That narrows it down less than you think." Mara replaced the lid. "I told him I had learned the difference between waiting and being left." Ruthie was quiet. Then she said that was not the whole truth. "No. Was it enough?" Mara looked through the kitchen window. From there she could see the upper half of the station clock above the roofs. 5:17. Always 5:17. It had to be. That evening, Cal rented room 7. Mara discovered it when she found his name in the register. Cal Rourke, 1 week paid in advance. His handwriting had changed. The letters were tighter, steadier, no ink blots, no careless tail beneath the R. Mara stared at it until Ruthie cleared her throat behind her. You have 6 empty rooms. 5, 6 before he came in. That is not the point. The bank accepts money even when it comes from men who broke your heart. Mara shut the register. He did not break my heart. Ruthie lifted one eyebrow. He wasted my time. That is usually how men break a woman's heart. They make her spend years proving it is not broken. Mara carried fresh towels upstairs. Room 7 was at the end of the hall. She stood outside it longer than necessary, then knocked once. Cal opened the door with his sleeves rolled and his gun belt hanging over the bedpost. He had unpacked almost nothing. A comb, a razor, a folded shirt, a small wooden box near the wash basin. Mara held out the towels. Breakfast is at 6, supper is at 7, water pump sticks, lift before you push. Cal took the towels. What time does the clock work? She looked at him. He nodded toward the depot window across the street, the station clock. It doesn't. I noticed. Then why ask? Because you used to hate broken things. I still do. Something moved behind his eyes. He set the towels on the chair. I sent word, Mara. Her chest tightened, not from hope, from anger so old it had learned patience. No, I did, no. You left a note on my windowsill saying you would be back by summer. Summer came, then winter, then another year. I sent 7 telegrams and 3 letters. Mara laughed once. It was not a kind sound. And I suppose every one of them fell off the same cliff. I don't know what happened. I do. Cal's jaw shifted. What? Nothing came. Silence settled between them. Downstairs, someone dragged a chair across the dining room floor. Cal looked at her as if the answer had changed the shape of the room. I sent the first telegram from Santa Rosa, he said. The second from Trinidad. The third after the freight company moved me north. I wrote when I got hurt. I wrote when I could ride again. Mara's hand tightened around the remaining towel. You got hurt? Wagon turned in a wash. Crushed my leg under the axle. He said it like weather. How long? 5 months before I could work. And you thought a telegram was enough? I thought it was what we agreed. We agreed you would come back. I tried. No, you wrote. Then you decided silence meant I had answered. He looked at her. That landed. Mara saw it. She hated that it mattered. Cal leaned one hand against the doorframe. I came back once. Her breath stopped. When? 3 years ago, late spring. You were here, outside town. The hallway seemed to narrow. How far outside? Ridge above the South Road. Mara stared at him. You came within 2 miles of me. I saw Vale's buggy at your house. Heard in Las Cruces that you were expected to marry him. And you turned around. Cal said nothing. You did. I thought you had made your choice. You thought. His voice lowered. I had no right to ride in and tear apart a life you wanted. You did not even ask whether it was mine. He looked toward the floor. That, more than any excuse, made her furious. Mara pushed the towel into his chest. Breakfast at 6. She turned away. Mara. She kept walking. Behind her, Cal said, I was wrong. She stopped at the stairwell but did not turn. Yes, she said, you were. Cal stayed. That was the first thing no one expected. He took work at Harlan's freight yard repairing wagon brakes, replacing split tongues and fitting new iron bands around wheels swollen by years of heat. He paid for room 7 every Monday. He ate breakfast at 6. He never asked Mara to sit with him, and every afternoon, a few minutes before 5:17, he found a reason to be near the depot. At first, Mara thought it was cruelty. Then she realized he never stepped onto the platform. He stayed across the street, near the livery, beside the water trough, outside Dawson's dry goods shop. Close enough to see her, far enough not to claim the moment. On the second Monday, Mara did not go. She stayed in the kitchen until 5:30, kneading bread that did not need kneading. When she finally looked through the window, Cal was standing beneath the dead clock alone. That hurt worse than she expected. The next week she returned to the platform. Neither of them spoke. The town watched anyway. Gideon Vale noticed too. Gideon owned the banknote on Ellison House, half the freight contracts in the county, and the depot lease that put every telegram in Cinder Wells beneath his roof. He dressed like Dust had signed an agreement not to touch him. Black coat, silver watch, boots polished at the heel. He came to Ellison House on Thursday morning carrying a leather document case. Mara met him in the parlor. Ruthie stayed in the kitchen with the door open. Gideon placed 3 papers on the table. The first is the balance on the note, he said. The second transfers the debt to a domestic settlement. The third is a marriage filing. Mara did not sit. You said I had until first snow. You do. This is October. There is no snow. There will be. He smiled slightly. Gideon's smiles were never warm. They were receipts. Mara picked up the first page. $640 had become $718. Late fees, inspection fees. A charge for replacing the well pump that Mara had paid for herself. This number is wrong. It is documented. It is invented. Careful. Ruthie's knife struck the cutting board in the kitchen. Once. Hard. Gideon glanced toward the sound, then back at Mara. You can fight the note, he said. You can spend money you do not have hiring a lawyer in Santa Fe. Or you can sign. The house remains yours in practice. Your debts disappear. Your future becomes secure. My future becomes yours. Our interests align. That is not marriage. No, it is survival. He pushed the papers closer. Saturday. The hotel dining room. I will have witnesses. Mara did not touch the pen. You speak like I already agreed. Gideon looked toward the window. Across the street, Cal was lifting a wagon wheel onto a repair stand. I have found that uncertainty disappears when a person runs out of alternatives. Mara followed his eyes. Is that what you think this is? I think a man who left once will leave again. Gideon gathered the papers, and I think you know it. When he was gone, Ruthie came into the parlor, wiping her hands on her apron. Mara stood with both palms pressed against the table. $718, she said. Ruthie looked at the figures. He added the pump twice. I know. The inspection fee is his own signature. I know. You cannot sign this. Mara lifted her head. With what money do I refuse? Ruthie had no answer. By Friday, the whole town knew Gideon intended to marry Mara, not because Mara had told anyone. Because Gideon had ordered champagne. Cinder Wells had never seen champagne outside a politician's funeral, and people treated the news with appropriate seriousness. At breakfast, Cal sat alone near the window. Mara poured coffee for every table, except his. When she reached the kitchen door, he said, Vale is telling people Saturday. She kept her back to him. He likes an audience. Are you going to sign? That is not your question to ask. I know. Then do not ask it. A chair creaked as he stood. I have money. Mara turned. The room went quiet enough that she could hear grease popping in the kitchen skillet. Cal kept his voice low. Not $700, but enough to make the payment and buy time. Mara set the coffee pot down. No. You have not heard the rest. I heard the part where you arrive late and try to purchase the years between us. That is not what I am doing. It is what it feels like. He took a breath. Then tell me what would not. Mara looked at him. There it was. The question she had wanted 4 years ago. Too late. I needed you to come back before I learned how to live without you. Cal absorbed that in silence. Then he nodded once. Mara picked up the coffee pot. At the door, he said, living without me is not the same as wanting Vale. She stopped. No, she said, but wanting has never kept a roof from being taken. Saturday arrived bright, cold, and windless. The hotel dining room smelled of stove coal, furniture polish, and roasted beef no one was eating. Gideon had arranged the papers at the head of a long table. The county clerk sat to his right. 2 bank witnesses sat to his left. Half the town found reasons to pass the open doorway. Mara entered wearing her mother's dark green dress, not a wedding dress. That mattered to her, even if no one else understood why. Cal stood near the back wall. He had not been invited. No one asked him to leave. Gideon rose. You came. You sent witnesses. I thought it best. For whom? His expression tightened, but only briefly. He pulled out the chair beside him. Mara remained standing. The clerk cleared his throat and began reading the terms. Debt consolidation, transfer of residence, shared property authority, marital filing. Each phrase sounded clean. That was the danger of paper. It could make a cage sound orderly. Mara looked toward Cal. He was watching her. Not Gideon, not the documents, her. For one reckless second, she wanted him to cross the room. She wanted him to say her name like it was a decision. She wanted him to break the silence he had mistaken for permission 4 years earlier. Cal did not move. The clerk finished. Gideon uncapped the ink bottle. Sign here. Mara took the pen. A murmur moved through the doorway. The nib hovered over the line. Then Mara saw the clock on the hotel wall. It worked. 5:16. 1 minute before the dead station clock had stopped forever. The room seemed to tilt. 4 years of Mondays. 4 years of excuses made for a man who had not asked. 4 years of holding one moment still while everything else moved around it. Mara set the pen down. Gideon's face changed. What are you doing? She looked at Cal. I waited until waiting made me smaller than the life I was trying to save. Cal's hand tightened at his side. Mara turned to Gideon. And I will not marry one man because another was too afraid to return. The doorway went silent. Gideon lowered his voice. If you walk out, I file foreclosure Monday morning. Then file it. You will lose the house, maybe. You will lose everything. Mara picked up her mother's gloves from the table. No, she said. I will lose what you can put on paper. She walked out. No one followed, not immediately. That was the worst part. Mara crossed the street without feeling the cold. She passed Ellison House, past the dry goods store, past the livery. She climbed the depot steps and stood beneath the dead clock, 5:17. The platform was empty. She laughed once, quietly, because of course it was. This was where empty things came to look permanent. Footsteps sounded behind her. She did not turn. If you came to offer money again, she said, keep walking. The footsteps stopped. It was not Cal. Ruthie Bell stood at the foot of the platform holding an old canvas mail pouch. I came to offer evidence. Mara turned. Ruthie climbed the steps slowly and set the pouch on a bench. The brass lock had been cut. I kept the telegraph office books before Vale pushed me out, she said. His nephew started clearing the storage room this morning. Found this behind the west pigeonholes. She opened the flap. Inside were yellowed envelopes, message slips, and a narrow ledger wrapped in twine. Mara recognized her name before Ruthie lifted the first paper. Miss Mara Ellison. Ellison House, Cinder Wells. The handwriting was Cal's. Her knees nearly gave. How many? 3 letters. Ruthie opened the ledger, and 7 telegram entries. Mara stared at the pages. Each message had a date. Each had a sending station, Santa Rosa, Trinidad, Pueblo. Each had been marked hold, then returned. The initials beside the instructions were GV. Gideon Vale. Mara touched one envelope, but did not pick it up. Why? Ruthie's mouth hardened. Your father's original property included the spring behind the boarding house. Every freight team in town waters there during dry months. Vale could foreclose, but the water claim might be challenged. Marriage would make the transfer quiet. Mara looked toward the hotel. He stopped the messages to get the house? He stopped the messages because a woman with hope is harder to corner. The words entered slowly. Mara felt anger, then grief, then something worse, relief. Relief that Cal had written, relief that she had not been forgotten. She hated the relief most of all. Where is he? Ruthie looked past her, learning the rest. Across town, Cal stood inside Gideon Vale's depot office with the telegraph ledger open on the desk. Gideon did not deny it. He closed the door, straightened one cuff, and said, You should be thanking me. Cal's voice was dangerously calm. For what? For teaching you what you are. Gideon leaned against the desk. I held paper, that is all. You were the one who came within 2 miles and turned around. Cal did not move. You saw my buggy and decided her life without you was settled. You chose pride because it hurt less than asking. Cal's jaw flexed. Gideon smiled. I did not keep you away for 4 years, Rourke. You did that yourself. For 1 second, Cal wanted to hit him. The desire came clean and hot, then it passed. A fist would give Gideon a simpler story. Cal closed the ledger. You forged delivery marks on interstate telegraph traffic. Gideon's smile faded. Prove it. Ruthie kept the carbon book. That landed. Cal watched the calculation begin behind Gideon's eyes. County clerk, territorial office, fraud charges, the banknote, the marriage papers, all of it shifting. Gideon stepped forward. What do you want? Cal looked at him. Nothing you can give me. He took the ledger and walked out. Mara was not at the depot when Cal arrived. Ruthie sat on the bench with the mail pouch beside her. She took the north path, Ruthie said. Cal looked at the letters. Did she read them? No. Why? Because finding out you wrote does not erase that you failed to come. Cal nodded. He had known that before she said it. He had only hoped evidence might make the truth less ugly. It did not. The north path climbed behind the abandoned water tower and opened onto a low ridge above Cinder Wells. Mara stood there with her mother's gloves in one hand and Cal's oldest letter in the other. The envelope was still sealed. The town below looked small from that height. The hotel, the bank, Ellison House, the depot clock, all the places that had measured her life without understanding it. Cal stopped several feet behind her. I am not going to ask you to read it. Mara looked over her shoulder. He held the telegraph ledger beneath one arm. Good, she said. Because I do not know if I can. You do not owe me that. She turned back to the ridge. For a while neither spoke. The wind moved through dry rabbit brush. A hawk turned once above the road. Finally Mara said, Were you coming back in that first letter? Yes. In the second? Yes. The third? I was asking you to meet me in Santa Rosa. I had enough saved for a room and the start of a freight stake, and when I did not answer, I kept writing until I got nothing back long enough to believe it was an answer. Mara looked at him. It was not. I know. No, you know now. Cal accepted the correction. Yes. She looked down at the sealed letter. You were close enough to see my roof. Yes. Close enough to knock. Yes. And you left. His voice dropped. Yes. The wind pushed his coat against his legs. Mara waited for an excuse. None came. Cal set the ledger on a flat rock. Vale can be stopped, he said. Ruthie's carbon book matches the marks in this ledger. The county clerk saw the marriage papers. The Territorial Telegraph Office will care about falsified delivery records, and the added fees on your note will not survive a proper accounting. You sound certain. I am certain about the evidence. And the house? It will take time, but he cannot foreclose Monday if the note is under fraud review. Mara searched his face. You did this for me? I did it because it was true. That is not what I asked. Cal took a breath. Yes, I did it for you. The answer sat between them. Then he added, but I am not asking for payment. Mara's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means the house is yours. Your choice is yours. If you tell me to leave Cinder Wells, I will still hand that ledger to the marshal and testify to every message I sent. Something in her chest loosened, but not enough. And if I tell you to stay? Cal looked toward town. When I left, I thought love was a promise about coming back. He faced her again. It is not. Mara said nothing. It is showing up when the answer might hurt. It is asking instead of deciding for someone. It is staying long enough to be known after the road has changed you. His voice roughened. I cannot give you back 4 years. No. I cannot make what I did smaller. No. I can tell you the truth before I know whether it saves me. Mara's fingers tightened around the letter. Cal stepped closer, then stopped well beyond her reach. I love you. The words were quiet. No witness, no crowd, no station clock to hold them in place. I loved you when I left. I loved you when I was too proud to ride down that ridge, and I loved you every mile back, though I had no right to expect it mattered. Mara looked away. Below them, a door opened at Ellison House. A tiny figure stepped onto the porch, probably Ruthie. Cal continued. I am asking to stay in Cinder Wells. Her eyes returned to him. Not in your house, not in your life, not unless you choose it. He glanced at the letter in her hand. And I will not ask you to wait one more day while I become a better man somewhere else. The ridge went still. Mara broke the seal. Cal's breath caught. She unfolded the brittle page. The ink had faded at the creases. She read only the first line. Mara, the wagon broke in the Pecos wash, but I am alive. She closed her eyes, not because the words repaired anything, because they proved there had been a man on the other side of the silence, young, hurt, trying, and then failing in a different way. Mara folded the letter carefully. When my mother died, she said, I stood at the depot for 3 hours. I knew no stage was coming. I stood there anyway. Cal's face tightened. I am sorry. I hated you that night. You had the right. I hated myself more. Why? Because part of me still believed you would step down from a wagon and make the world reasonable again. Cal looked at her with open pain. Mara continued, I will never be that woman again. I am not asking you to be. Good. She walked toward him until only one step remained between them. If you stay, you do not stay because you rescued my house. I know. You do not stay because your letters were stolen. I know. You stay because tomorrow morning there will be 12 beds to strip, a roof to mend, and a bank hearing to prepare for. A small, uncertain smile touched his mouth. I can mend a roof. Room 6 leaks at the chimney. I will start there. And when people talk, they will. That was not my question. Cal held her gaze. I will stay. Mara studied him for another long moment, then she placed the sealed open letter against his chest. His hand came up over it, but he did not touch her. Not yet, she said. Ask me properly. Cal's eyes changed. Not with relief, with attention, the kind he should have given 4 years earlier. Mara Ellison, he said, may I walk back to town with you? She let the silence hold just long enough. Yes. He stepped beside her, not ahead, not behind. They started down the ridge together. At the depot, Ruthie had climbed a ladder and opened the face of the old station clock. She claimed later that she had only meant to inspect the gears. No one believed her. As Mara and Cal reached the bottom of the path, Ruthie pulled a nest of dust and wasp paper from the mechanism. A trapped weight dropped 6 inches. The minute hand shuddered, then moved. 5:18. Mara stopped. Cal looked up. All along the street, heads turned toward the sound. One tick, then another. The clock had lost 4 years and gained 1 minute. Mara watched it long enough to feel the old habit ask her to stay. Then she looked at Cal. Room 6, she said. He nodded. Room 6. They crossed the street together. Behind them, the station clock kept ticking. It did not give back the years. It did not excuse the silence. It only did what time had always been trying to do: move. The clock still read 5:18 when Mara walked away from it. For the first time in 4 years, neither of them was waiting for it to move.